and we're glad to have you here. This is a symposium series that has been going on in one form or another since 1996. So UVU has a long-standing commitment to try to engage issues of religious diversity and difference in an effort to build bridges of understanding and practice, and it's been great fun to be part of that effort. So I assume most of you have seen the schedule that we have posted. This is the first session of this symposium. We'll begin again tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock and run through 1:30 p.m. And if you would like a link to the webpage where we have the full schedule, we have a QR code out on the poster, and you can just pull that up into your phone. But we're looking forward to having 4 sessions tomorrow on various aspects of our theme. What we're doing this afternoon is we're delighted to be hosting a film screening which is entitled "The Prayers of Both Could Not Be Answered," and I'm going to invite the writer and director, Danny Drysdale, to spend 2 or 3 minutes just giving you a primer on the film, and then we'll go right into the screening. And then when we come back in about 40 minutes, I'll introduce the panelists and we'll have some discussion and Q&A. So, Danny.
Hello, everyone. This is totally unrehearsed. First of all, I want to thank Brian for bringing us out for this event, or for this symposium. It's a pleasure to be here and to discuss or show and discuss our film, "The Prayers of Both Could Not Be Answered." This is the first film of a series of films that we're doing that's entitled "Religious Thought During Times of National Crisis." I personally feel that the documentary delivers a unifying message to all political beliefs, religious faiths. That's the goal. The only operating bias is that I do have a kindness in my heart for Abraham Lincoln. So, I hope you enjoy it. I want to thank Christopher for bringing me on to make this film, and we've worked really hard to bring this message to life. And it basically analyzes Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address and how he employs religious language in a very short speech to try and bring together a losing South and an angry North. Enjoy the film.
So just a couple of words before we begin. We have some people who are tuning in via live stream. If you are, we're going to continue to run the live stream, but we won't be showing the film in the feed. So if you go to the conference webpage, you'll see a thumbnail there. So if you click on that, it will take you right into the YouTube version, and it will be a much smoother process. And then you can tune back in for the live stream in about 40 minutes. So without further ado, I'll start it up. So I'd like to invite our panelists to come up to the front. I will give them a brief introduction, and then we have until 4 o'clock for Q&A. I've asked each of the panelists to take whatever time within a 7 to 8 minute range they can to speak to the film from their perspective, their angle of vision. We're very pleased, as you'll see, to have people who are involved both in the production of the film and also scholars who can speak to the historical context of the film. So please come forward. And Courtney, if we can take the lights up. So as I mentioned, we've got people who are involved both in the production and direction and the film content, along with great scholars. So to your far right is Danny Drysdale, who you heard from before the film started. He is an award-winning documentary filmmaker and the co-founder of 8 Little Crickets production company, right? That's in my new top 5 production company names. He's also the content development director for Capitol Reef Productions as well. So Danny, we're so glad that you could join us, and Danny will open up by providing some background and context on the development of the film. To Danny's right is Christopher Stevenson, who is the president and co-founder of the National Museum of American Religion, which is a years-long effort to, in his words, preserve the ideal of religious freedom as a governing principle in the United States. And Chris is a newfound friend of UVU and of our center, and we're happy to have him traveling out from Virginia to talk about how his organization was involved in the film and what things look like going forward, as Danny mentioned. To Chris's right is Kevin Wolfe, who you will hear from both in this panel, but also in our keynote session tomorrow at 11 o'clock. Kevin is an assistant professor of religion at Claremont Graduate University, where he specializes in what he calls the blurry terrain between religious thought and political theory. And he's working on 2 book projects at the moment. The most immediate one is entitled Justifying Democracy Beyond Nietzsche's Critique. And then he will turn his attention to his second book project, which is entitled Democratic Social Criticism Beyond Jeremiad. So Kevin, thank you for coming. Appreciate you being here. And last but not least, to Kevin's right is Michael Goode, who is an associate professor of history here at UVU, and someone who is not a stranger to many of us. Michael's areas of specialization include early American Atlantic world history, religion and political culture, Native American history, slavery and abolition, and peace history. And I have the pleasure of serving alongside Michael in the Center for the Study of Ethics, and we also work together in his efforts in connection with the Peace and Justice Studies program. So with that, we'll start with Danny. We'll move down the line. The intent of this is for them to stimulate and provoke questions from you, and we hope that there are ample questions that come out of our discussion here. So, Danny.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for watching the film. I guess the interesting place to start to kind of explain my perspective on creating the film was meeting Christopher and basically receiving an assignment to create a film about Lincoln's religious thought and his politics without making a film that's either religious or political. And just stay in the center, and allow the chips to fall where they will. And the beauty of that, I would say, in that discovery, in that method of discovery, is that we found all of these interesting other things in the process, especially within the range of creating context around the period when he gave the speech. And some of those items in the film are, to me, those moments that are kind of like, well, did you realize this, or did you know this was happening, or did you know that these people may have felt this way? And these different perspectives sort of come to life. And that's a surprising dynamic and kind of cool. And I'm excited about making more films in that way, because those stories are always forgotten in the bigger picture. So that nuance is a fun discovery. The name of my company that I started years ago is based on the idea that nobody is going to ever pay attention to anything that I'm doing. So if you tell a joke, it's a very sarcastic title. If you tell a joke and it's not funny, people make the cricket sound. Big crickets are gross, so we call them little. And 8 is a lucky number. That's literally, it's as meta as you can get. So it's diminutive, it's like lucky, it's based on everything that could go wrong. I was listening to a lot of English music at the time. I think that's where it came from. Being influenced by people in England or something. It's really cool that there's like a subtlety that's coming out from that idea, that motif of how to create art. And even though this is somewhat of a departure from what I started doing, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to work with this subject matter. And that's all I have to say.
All right. So I'll tell you a little bit about the National Museum of American Religion, which commissioned this film. We're grateful that Danny put it together. It's a beautiful film. So the National Museum of American Religion is a digital-first startup museum that aims to tell the story of what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion. In that latter part, that second side of the coin includes the establishment of this revolutionary and now indispensable idea of religious freedom as a governing principle. So this idea of creating a museum came from realizing that this slice of the historical pie of American history, what religion has done to the country, it was not or is not part of the beautiful Smithsonian museums in the nation's capital, where I grew up. So I grew up right outside of D.C. My dad worked on the National Mall, so I'd visit him when I was young and go out to his back door, and there it was. So I really got to know those museums where a lot of people go to find out what the essence of this American experiment is. And it's a beautiful tapestry that they weave. And I loved it, and it gave me a great and profound respect for this American project. But later on in my life, I came to realize that religion has played an outsized role in this country, for good and ill. We have to be honest. Religion has done beautiful things, but religion has also done dastardly things. As a good friend of mine said, religion kills and religion heals. So it hasn't been always a beautiful story, but it has been an outsized influence in the American project. But no one really knows about it. And there are reasons why the Smithsonian doesn't do it. It's very difficult to tell that story as the Smithsonian. And it's also not in our history classes in middle and in high schools. So really, we discovered or backed into this fact that we felt Americans don't really know who they are. And so we said, hey, let's build a museum that tells the story of what religion has done to the country and what the country has done to religion. So that's what we're doing. And we were contemplating a fundraiser several years ago. We thought, hey, what's a good topic? Well, religious thought during times of national crisis, because national crises are compelling stories. And really, national crises in some ways define a country, right? And if our thesis is true that religion has played a role in every aspect of American society, it must be present in these really important crises. And so we're going down this road now of investigating national thought during times of national crisis. We picked Lincoln's second inaugural because, as it says in the film, he's one of the three, what most Americans believe are one of the three greatest presidents. This is not shared, I should say, by many Native Americans. They don't hold Lincoln up on a pedestal. By many Black Americans, but it is true that he occupies a large part of the American historical psyche. So we thought, let's investigate the religious thoughts found in his second inaugural. Second inaugural is very famous, very well known, very beautiful, but we didn't think the religious thoughts of Lincoln were ever really raised up and examined. So we thought, this will be compelling for audiences. Let's do this. And I think Danny did a wonderful job. What the museum has to offer is always, what has religion done? Whatever story it is we're telling is, we're focused on what has religion done and what have we done to religion. So that's where we got to this film, and this might come out in our Q&A or in our discussion, but we are on to Danny's starting the production of our second film, which will be all about, we'll be exploring religion's roles in the American response to the 9/11 terrorist attack, which will be very profound, we think, and will bring us up to, it's good for the museum because the museum is not stuck on just Christianity, which certainly has had an outside influence on the American project, but there's been other non-Christian faiths involved, and they come to the fore, of course, there in the response to the 9/11 terrorist attack. So that's all I have to say here at this intro.
Thank you, and I hope that you all don't get banned in Florida. So, more than tomorrow. Actually, so I have too much to say, and as a result, I'm not going to say that much. And rather, I'm going to kind of try to pick on one thing to kind of hopefully give Michael kind of an opportunity to teach me some things before you all get to hear me talk at you all for a bit. One of the characters that didn't really come across in the movie as much as kind of my interest, curiosity lies is the Constitution, right? So we know that everything ends up being about preserving the Union, and the Constitution for Lincoln ends up being absolutely crucial, right? When you read the first inaugural, right, everything ends up being, look, we're not about to start a war against you. We're not going to be oppressors against you, in part precisely because of what the Constitution allows and doesn't allow. And we get, by the second inaugural, this theodicy where somehow God has allowed the war, but at the same time you get this, what seems to me as a kind of tension where, so let me actually read some of what he said. So in the first inaugural, he's gonna write, I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the U.S., in the states where it exists, rather, sorry. I believe I have no lawful right to do so. And I have no inclination to do so. He will continue in the first, let's see, right, that there's much controversy about the delivering up of fugitives from service of labor. The clause I now read is plainly written in the Constitution as any of its provisions, and so for him, preserving the Union ends up being this constitutional demand, and that the Constitution and universal law work hand in hand historically and in perpetuity. By the time we get to war and we get to the second inaugural, we get pretty much consistency there, right? So he's going to say, to strengthen and to strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object of which for which insurgents would rend the Union, right? To extend and expand slaveocracy, right? To perpetuate and expand it is what the insurgents wanted. And that ends up being the thing. Don't expand it. Do not expand it. Do not expand it, right? And so he's gonna say, regret the Union even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. So kind of all of that is to then kind of ask the question with regard to the theodicy that we see in that somehow it's kind of God's will working out through history. How do we tell the story of at least these different characters, right? The Constitution, the Union, God's will, so on and so forth. So I don't have much to say about that.
Well, I think Kevin, actually, you hit a lot of really good notes, and I think that what I would just end up doing here is just adding some detail on some of the questions that you raised. First of all, Danny, I'd like to say that I'm from Chicago, and my mother's from Central Illinois, so I grew up in the shadow of Lincoln, and I have a soft spot for Lincoln. I went to, went to his gravesite, and it was like one of these rituals you did when you were a young person in Illinois. So I have a real deep admiration for what you're doing here. Brian has asked me to sort of speak as an historian. This is slightly outside I'm an early American historian. I do the American Revolution and what comes before, but this is, I'll do my best here. So in the 19th century, among non-slaveholding whites in the United States, and I would include Lincoln, it's important, one thing just as a contextual thing, the opposition to slavery, you could be opposed to slavery but not be in favor of racial equality. And so that's an important point, right, to keep in mind. In our world, right, if I asked you, how many people are opposed to slavery, you would all hopefully raise your hand. And if I said, how many are in favor of racial equality, hopefully most of all of you would raise your hand as well. And that's a world that we live in, but that's not the 19th century world. In the 19th century world, it's a world in which you can be opposed to slavery, but not be in favor of racial equality. So Lincoln started, like many white Americans in the 19th century, he started out not as an abolitionist. He gave a famous speech in 1854, in which he was laying out his objections to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And he called slavery a monstrous injustice, and I'm quoting from him. One that invites America's enemies to see us in the United States as hypocrites, right? But the question becomes, what do you do with emancipated slaves? It's something I tell students in the aftermath of the American Revolution and the early Republic period of the United States. 1/5 of the population of the United States, 1/5 was African American, and a majority of whom were enslaved. So imagine what the prospect of immediate emancipation would entail. It's a massive transfer of people into a question of, like, what do you do with them, right? Like, do they become citizens? Are slaveholders to be compensated? Because the system of slavery as it existed in the United States, people that were held in enslavement were considered property and were major forms of wealth for slaveholders. And so this question of slaveholder compensation and again, what you do with African Americans, do you grant them citizenship? Do African American men get the right to vote? These are major questions. The majority of whites in the United States in the 19th century would have been opposed to immediate emancipation, would have been opposed to granting African Americans citizenship. So what do you do? So the way in which many Americans, including Lincoln, handled this is that they were in favor, if they were opposed to slavery, and many Americans were not, of course, because of their deep investments in slavery, but if they were opposed to slavery, they were in favor of something called gradual emancipation. So many northern states passed gradual emancipation acts and the emphasis is on gradual. It would free people after the passage of these acts, after, in some cases, 28, 30 years of servitude. And so, again, the emphasis here is putting slavery on some sort of path to extinction, but in a way that doesn't threaten the slaveholders' property rights. And so Lincoln, going into the presidency, was a supporter of gradual emancipation. He was not unique in that regard. He was also a supporter of colonization. And this was probably more popular among white Americans certainly than abolitionism. And what colonization meant was if you have a population of either free African Americans or emancipated African Americans, to encourage them to, quote, go back to Africa. And the colony that they had in mind was Liberia. The problem, of course, with these positions is that slave owners in the United States opposed gradual emancipation by and large. They were rejected the idea of giving up their property investments, human investments, right? The second problem, of course, is African Americans had genealogical descent in the United States going back before the United States, deeply, multiple generations, so there's an intertwined history with North American slavery that goes back to the 16th century. And so it's almost a ridiculous and absurd notion to send somebody back to Africa when many African Americans had roots in North America that were deeper than many white Americans, especially in the 19th century when we had a surge of recent immigration. So, colonization was not, to say the least, popular for African Americans. Lincoln, being a good lawyer, entered the presidency with no intention of ending slavery, and this is exactly as Kevin is suggesting. Slavery was embedded in the Constitution in the 3/5 clause, the Fugitive Slave Clause. So the Civil War changed that. 200,000 African Americans served in the Union forces in the Civil War. Without a question, they were critical to the success of the war. And this changes Lincoln. And maybe he doesn't come quite up to being a proponent of racial equality, but he commits to abolition as a military measure. And that includes, of course, famously the Emancipation Proclamation. The second inaugural, I'm just going to move forward real quick to wrap this up. The second inaugural address, I believe, sort of asserts a contradiction. Lincoln wants to, and I'm using his words, to sort of bind up the nation's wounds caused by the Civil War and to move towards a lasting peace. But he interprets the war as a divine punishment for the sin of slavery, which white Americans were complicit. So why is this a contradiction? Well, in my view, post-Civil War reconciliation of Northerners and Southerners meant increasing indifference and eventually outright opposition to racial equality and full inclusion of African Americans as citizens. The Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, which were passed, of course, after Lincoln's assassination, briefly flirted with the idea of resolving this contradiction that Lincoln sort of raised. The contradiction of reconciliation between the North and the South, but also inclusion of African Americans and citizens. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment provided equal protection and, importantly, birthright citizenship, which underscored, it was a rejection of the Dred Scott decision, and it was essentially stating that African Americans born in the United States were citizens like anyone else. And the 15th Amendment granted the right to vote for African American men. Now, speaking maybe as in moral terms, not as an historian, the challenge of the 14th Amendment then, and I'll phrase this up in one quick phrase, equality and diversity. And this was taken up briefly in the early Reconstruction years, but it was eventually, of course, and quite famously rejected in favor of white supremacist frames of government. So by the late 19th century, the Supreme Court in 1883 nullified the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and the Civil Rights Act then was guaranteeing all citizens, including African Americans, public access, equal access to accommodations, theaters, public schools, and churches. And the Supreme Court in 1883 deemed that unconstitutional. More famously, the Supreme Court in 1896, in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation. And that's the infamous separate but equal doctrine. So, what's the main takeaway here for me? one takeaway, of course, is that we haven't lived up to the promise. If the second inaugural is, in some sense, Lincoln raising up a contradiction, the promise of the 14th Amendment as an answer to that contradiction demands equality and diversity. And I think what I would say is, we live in a time period in which we have not worked out the problem of and challenges of racial inequality, obviously, and that to move forward, there is no reconciliation without equality. That's a moral position. I'm not speaking as a historian, but as a moral person, as a human being, I would say reconciliation is not possible without equality, and we haven't lived up to it. And then finally, of course, that this is, I'm emphasizing racial equality, but the racial equality issue is also a religious diversity issue. Americans' religious institutions remain deeply segregated in the United States. And this reminds me of, what was it, that Martin Luther King quote, that Sunday was the most segregated day of the week, and he's referring to that segregation. So this is a racial equality issue. It's tied to economic equality, or the challenges of economic equality, but it's also a religious inclusion issue, and they're all sort of wrapped up in my mind, and this is what I think the film sort of raises.
All right, thanks to each of you. We have several minutes left for Q&A. So we've got a microphone that we'll roll around with. The ground rules of the microphone are that you must ask a question succinctly and directly, that it must be a question and not a comment, and that you surrender the microphone once you've asked your succinct question. So with that,
That just eliminated everybody.
Yeah, including us. So we'll start here.
Manifest destiny is really something that is extremely interesting. And I like to know when and if that's going to be abolished in the United States. That's the question, right?
So one way to actually tell the story of the Civil War across the pond, right, is that it's just that, a civil war across the pond. You get Brits angry at their British king because the Brits don't really want to pay taxes. Why that story misses so much of what happened and has everything to do with the ways in which the Puritan imagination ends up, and this is where Manifest Destiny is absolutely central to just the concept, the notion that somehow these people are, we're talking now 2 continents in this hemisphere, American, but these specific people in this territory, they are the Americans, right? And it has everything to do with the Puritan imagination kind of latching on to this idea. So part of what I failed to ask in my question about the character, about the Constitution, has to do with the ways in which trying to tell the story, whether it's of Lincoln or any kind of these other figures, as kind of simply a Christian story, and let's say the figure of God functioning in history as a kind of just a Christian story, misses the way in which this territory, the Constitution, and the people who become in their own, at least their own imagination, and then because of how the world sees them as Americans, kind of tell this new religious story about themselves, that Manifest Destiny is a serious part of it, that is as important to them as Jesus, for example. So, short answer, I don't know if Manifest Destiny could be eradicated.
I like, to me, in all of the supposed Well, the entire discussion in the movie is actually surrounding manifest destiny. And if that kind of conflict is brought about because people think I'm doing this because God told me to, I mean, that's absurd. And so how in the world are we going to overcome that kind of stupidity? Is basically what I'm saying.
Yeah, so that question actually is just way above my pay grade, right?
That's definitely worth a film. That's definitely worth doing a film about. I mean, honestly.
Are deeply intertwined. And so one way to address what you're saying is that the challenge of inclusion and the struggle for racial equality must also address colonization and the legacies of ongoing colonization for Indigenous Americans, and I couldn't agree more.
But you don't get a sense of this new figure on the world stage called the American without it. And it's not just a set of ideas used to justify colonization. It's like the character type, the kind of raison d'etre of this figure called the American that emerges, right? Has everything to do with how this kind of God kind of supported mission it plays out. So we can agree that it's ridiculous, but many people would say anybody's religiousness, any part of it, could be seen as ridiculous. So I agree with it.
Let's move on.
I appreciate the movie. It was amazing. Thank you. I was wondering, I noticed the quote but from Mark Knoll at the beginning of the movie. I was wondering how much impact his book on Lincoln as a theologian had on the movie and your writing of this, and any other impacts, any other influences that you have.
So Mark Knoll, he wrote a book called The Civil War: A Theological Crisis, which is a beautiful framing of the Civil War in very religious terms, of course, by the title. And it had a great influence on me and my thinking. I don't know about Danny and the filmmaking. But the quote that we had is a beautiful quote about the religious landscape as it approached the Civil War. So I was going to say something else and I just forgot it. But it's a great book, and yeah.
That quote ended up at the beginning of the film because of one of the scholars on our, I guess the story consultants on the film. What's his name?
Jordan Watkins.
Yeah, Jordan Watkins. He saw the film and was like, and he quoted that, or he gave me that quote, and I'm like, that's the beginning of our film. That's where that came from. So I guess I need to read some Mark Knoll. I'm so sorry to admit that, but it's totally.
You're filming.
Yeah, I'll get to it.
Mark Knoll is an historian, to say.
Yes.
To put it out there, he's an historian.
It's lining up though, right? That's what I feel like good about that.
When you're talking about religion and the Civil War, by the way, thanks for this wonderful event today, and all of your input. I had wished everyone wants to, tweak your film a bit, and I had wished that you had told the story of the schisms within American religious communities that prepared the way, right, for Americans to kill each other. You don't kill your own brothers and sisters or your church. So what you have is a schism. You have Southern Baptists, Northern Baptists, Presbyterians, then those heretics, right, who are misinterpreting the Bible. We can kill them.
I like this. This is cool. Yeah, that's a great approach.
I did part of my dissertation on this, so someone's got to listen to me. Anyhow, this is a very, I think, next time that backstory is really a cool story to say, what's happening in America today among the religious communities on various issues. They're having schisms, and that's why you hear people say, oh, we are really in trouble, meaning our own religious communities are breaking apart over this, so we can fight dirty. Right?
Rosetta Ross, who speaks about the congregations of slaves being taught Christianity and being like good Christians, while believing that they're meant to be free because they are meant to be free. That opened this subject, and we were talking about this earlier, about these multiple operating Christianities that were occurring, kind of independent of one another. And that's a really cool topic to discern between these different versions of Christianity. And so I like that. I'll call that the schism criticism.
So the question underlying that, Kevin, probably is for you. I sense in you this pushback on a reduction to either colonial oppression due to economic factors. Give us a little bit more on what you have studied, and also, Michael, where does this thing come from in Puritanism or beyond Puritanism? Is it somehow in Christianity's proselytizing idea? Where does that American stuff come from?
That's an impossible question to answer for an historian, because you're asking, I think, these large questions that are really for historians to answer. So, having said that, there is no one Christianity historically, and there are multiple Christianities. There are multiple Puritanisms, actually. It's hard to generalize in some ways. So there is a pro-slaveholding, colonizing Christianity. Then there are forms of Christianity that are in that process of the development of Atlantic and growth of Atlantic slavery and colonization. There's a tradition came out in opposition to that, and they're relational. I don't see these. So there are many multiple Christianities, but they're not separate historically. So, for example, that pro-slavery ideology that preached to African Americans to be docile and humble, it was also a Christianity in which slaveholders were anxious to portray themselves as godly patriarchs. That theology was in response to abolitionist and then earlier anti-slavery critiques that used Christianity to say that the slave trade is immoral because it broke up families, and that slaveholders were violent and ungodly, not so much for slaveholding in the early modern period. The critique centered on their avaricious appetites. And so those critiques stuck and lingered, and people like Frederick Douglass, who was biblically literate, and many, many others, took up these legacies and developed I think a fairly coherent anti-slavery theology, and pro-slavery ideologies were responding to that. So there are multiple Christianities historically, and they're relational, and their developments are relational, and that's what gives, I think, the complexity.
And all that being true, when I said Puritanism, all I was trying to get us to see is that there is, so if there's one thing that puts them together, it's tied to Winthrop's claim on the Arabella that this is the city on the hill, right? That's going to reverberate. Thank you. That's going to reverberate, to Reagan, to Obama, right? That this is the shining city on the hill from Winthrop on the Arabella. So that, regardless of the various differences, ends up fueling the kind of imagination of what these variety of people who are arguing and fighting over their differences on this territory as they move westward, what God put them here to do, right? And that kind of religious mission can't be, so So, yes, I push on reductive kind of historical things. But for me, I don't really have a specific dog in today's fight. I'm not trying to say I thought it was brilliant. I was just trying to start a fight with Michael, really. But all that is to say is that I don't think we can tell the religious story of the U.S. outside of a project of racialization, which is tied to this thing called American Christianity, as well as the way in which the creation of this new character on the world stage by the 18th century called the American, that could actually start a revolutionary war against the British king, and not just be a civil war against my king as an English subject. Right? The idea that somehow these characters are different than English subjects, that they are American, that has everything to do with this thing I'm calling the Puritan imagination that emerges, and it's tied to this kind of religious ethos of us in this territory.
Maybe to summarize, yeah, because I totally agree.
Different.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, maybe the question is like, where are the origins of American exceptionalism? And that's maybe what I think we're speaking about different things. So I totally agree. And there is a history of that, right, too. Just the origin, the religious sort of contributions to the idea of American exceptionalism, which has deep roots as well. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask the final question if I can. This is directed more toward Chris and Danny. Can you talk about the reception of the film in the different communities in which it's been screened, and you talked about it, both in the scholarly community and in other forums?
Nobody has no one's been negative to me about it yet. I don't know if they're just hiding or what's happening. It's been very positive at different campuses. I'd be interested to see. I'm not inviting like weird questions or anything, or like people being angry or something, but I'm interested to see counterpoint. I'm feeling it, like, you know, what is the film not addressing? And I just want to say that there's a certain economy to the messaging of the film that we're really trying to stay true to. And a lot of it has to do with the mission of the museum. And the other part is there's almost this intention of trying to get away with what you can in the time allotted without starting too big of another topic so that it feels like we left something out. We may have done that with the constitutional character that you're talking, this character of the Constitution. But that opens a whole other like realm. And I think of that as like a spike in a film where it's either there to provoke you into some kind of issue thinking-wise, or it's just a sloppy way of making, like, the film's incomplete. So I'm really trying to encapsulate the messaging into a more like firm message, like a very finite amount of things. So.
And I'll just add, we've done a screening at Pepperdine with Ed Larson, and they really didn't want the next one.
Okay, that was the question. Sorry about that.
And we did it at BYU, which was great, and then we are doing it at we're planning on doing it at HBCUs, a tour of those. Derek on the film, Derek Hicks was very interested in that. So it's been super positive, and people wanting more.
And we're gonna do a special screening potentially with Condoleezza Rice in the Bay Area. And HBCU is coming from people that have seen it, and it's grown on a referral basis. You know, as we've shown it around, there's been like word of mouth interest in it. So it's going well. It's going well.
Thank you. We are at time. I want to take an opportunity also to thank another organization that was connected with the film, the Foundation for Religious diplomacy led by Charles Randall Paul here in the front. Randall, please raise your hand and acknowledge. Yeah. You'll be hearing from both Michael and Randall tomorrow in the second session at 10 o'clock on peace building methodology. And we're looking forward to all 4 sessions tomorrow. We hope you can make it. If you want to know what the schedule is, like I said before, there's a QR code that you can scan out on the poster, or you can just Google UVU ethics and you'll get a link to the webpage. But I want to thank each of you for participating in the panel and enriching us here at UVU. So please join me in welcoming or thanking them.